The second half of this chapter, starting with section 15.3, healing systems. They first talk to us about ethnomedical systems, systematic ways of explaining, recognizing, reacting to, accommodating, and treating disease and illness within a society. So as we talked about, people experience diseases differently, and they also think about them and treat them in various ways to the point that we can point to the point that in some societies we can say that they have developed a structured system of trying to address various illnesses and issues within their society, which might be different from our own. In these ethnomedical systems, one of the goals, of course, is healing. What's the goal of healing? Yeah, so obviously we do want to get rid of the pain. Sometimes we want to go through the pain, push through the pain, you might say, but eventually we do want to, in some ways, treat that. And sometimes perhaps our health systems, our own health systems, don't take into account as much as how it also means trying to restore that positive connection that we have, feelings about ourselves and our connections to others. So in many other societies, the process of treating an illness or disease is not just seen as treating each individual, but as trying to integrate those individuals back into society. There's a couple examples of this or different ways in which this is done. They call these personalistic healing systems. And in these, again, as we just talked about, that there's also the belief that when you are sick, it's partly because your relationships have been in some ways disrupted with other people or perhaps with the supernatural order. So this is a picture from page 447 of the Buryat people who live in Siberia, gone through various things. If you believe that your illness is in some ways being caused by a disruption of not just the natural order, but the supernatural order, then someone who is a specialized practitioner, we referred to as a shaman, is trying to connect those spiritual and physical worlds and restore this balance. Shamans have gotten a bad rap. In modern societies, we often try to suppress the work of people who are doing this, and they referred to in the Soviet Union, these practices were very much suppressed. We talked about in the last class how certain ancestor worship practices in China were also suppressed. So in some ways, these people have been persecuted for trying to do these kinds of things. And I'm not trying to say that we should all go out and find a shaman to heal us, but if you are part of that tradition, this can be a very important mental and spiritual part of your healing process. In this, they also talk about various naturalistic healing systems, which again sometimes get a bad rap, or perhaps sometimes an overly good rap, as people want to just herb it out and not get vaccinated. But there are some very old ways in which people have done this ever since we were people, maybe even before we were people. When we talk about modern medicine and some of the advances we've made, many of the drugs that we use are actually synthesized from the traditional knowledge of people who were dealing with various plants in their environment. Quinine to treat or to prevent against malaria, for example, was something that was used by people in South America, and then the medical or the scientists elaborated and discovered it and turned it into pill form. And so there's a lot of traditional or local knowledge that is contained in and has been used by people from the time that we were people. So these, again, I'm not trying to say that you should all go take herbs and get your shaman together and do acupuncture, but if it is part of your tradition, it can be an important way in which we restore our health and balance to the world. Now, in today's world, most people practice what anthropologists call medical pluralism, or syncretism, which means fusing different ideas together. And so many people don't just rely on one form of healing, they will combine different healing systems together. For example, when you get sick, have to go to the doctor or something's happened to you that's bad, do you do anything else besides just go there and take the pills or whatever? Is there anything else you might do? Yeah. Rest. Yes, you should rest. I definitely prescribe rest. That is a very good thing to do. That's probably part of our biomedical tradition as well. Anything else? Anybody do anything else when they get sick? Yeah.
Drinking like ginger ale to help you.
That's definitely up there. Yes, you should hydrate. I'm giving out medical advice, and I don't know if I should, but yes, keep hydrated. Ginger ale is one of those quick ways to, as soon as any of my kids get sick, I just go out and buy a big case of ginger ale and start telling them to suck it down and go rest. Those things are both true. Maybe you don't do this, but whenever something happens in our family, all of a sudden my parents are like, all right, we'll go to the doctor and we'll start praying for you, right? So most people combine, many people, I can't get you to admit it, they'll be like, okay, well, I'm going to take this aspirin. I'm also going to go light a candle to the Virgin and give myself a few ups on the prayer chain or something like that. And this is true in our society as well as in other societies. So a lot of people combine. You can go down and try out some acupuncture, some herbal remedies if you want. And in those societies where these things are also traditional cures, many people in these societies combine what we would call ethnomedicine, or maybe traditional forms, with some antibiotics, some shots and things like that. Now, biomedicine is something that is all over the world, and it is linked to what our contemporary structure of health inequalities. And so in the same way that we have these kinds of economic inequalities, we also see large inequalities in people's access to healthcare, how much they are able to pay for healthcare, differences in health among different social groups. In part because, as your text said, health has become commodified. So people pay for various treatments. Those that can go on medical tourism go to different places and can get different kinds of healthcare treatments that might not be available. But if you can't travel or pay for health, then you might be in some ways out of luck. They talk about a notion that has been introduced to us by the French philosopher Michel Foucault, the idea of biopower. And what he was saying, and that anthropologists have elaborated on, is that often in today's world, or for the last couple hundred years, governments and various institutions have become very interested in regulating bodies and health, and not just all for positive reasons. It seems to be part of a structure in which something like public health, and again, I'm not going to get down on public health, but sometimes it can be targeted at certain groups, and certain groups get treatments and interventions, and others are not seen as deserving of that, or others are simply the guinea pigs for those kinds of treatments. And so many of the interventions that we have in our society, we talked about how in the last chapter on death and dying, how some people who whose bodies were used for medical experiments, the contemporary practice of gynecology was often first used on enslaved women in the United States. And so it creates this system in which there's a mismatch of power and treatment for various groups. And there are reasons why some groups in the society are very suspicious of the medical system and experiments. There are some pretty famous experiments that have gone terribly wrong for these groups. Now, one idea to address these inequalities is the idea that we should, for those who are going into biomedicine and going into being doctors and nurses, is that we teach them we call structural competency. Ava, structural competency. What is that? This is an effort to recognize that some groups are not going to have the same access to healthcare. We talked about idioms of distress, that people might express themselves differently. And so trying to teach potential doctors, nurses, public health people to recognize these kinds of barriers, and that would improve on there we go. Patient doctor encounters that have, if people are at least aware of these kinds of structural problems. That's solve our problems. We all just learn to be nice, smart, learn about these structural barriers. At the end of the chapter, they say that, yeah, obviously it is good if you're going into the medical profession or just to be aware of in general that there are these structural barriers, and you may have to advocate for yourself if you're in a group that has been traditionally disadvantaged. But if we're going to make real improvements, you're going to have to actually address those structural barriers, not just learn about them. And whether that will happen is we'll try. I want to show you something to be slightly more hopeful at the end of this. It's a little segment from Paul Farmer called I Believe in Healthcare as a Human Right. Paul Farmer was a medical doctor and an anthropologist. Talked about him a tiny bit back when we were talking about structural violence. So he's the one who came up with this idea that in some ways violence is not just what we hurt each other with guns or knives or in wars, but it can be a systematic way in which people who are poor or marginalized are then exposed to more diseases and have worse health outcomes. And so it's a form of violence, which may not be, well, it is manifested physically, but it's not point of the gun violence. Paul Farmer, pretty famous person for his interventions in public health and in medicine and in anthropology, unfortunately passed away too young at the age of 62 in Rwanda, where he was working at the time.